People love to imagine the Middle Ages as a time of honor, castles, and rugged simplicity, a world where life was natural, untouched by modern excess. But there is one detail almost everyone gets dangerously wrong. Medieval people were not dirty because they didn't care. They were dirty because the world they lived in made cleanliness almost impossible. And the truth of how medieval humans actually lived inside their own bodies is far more disturbing than popular history wants to admit. Here is the shocking claim that breaks the illusion. Personal hygiene in the Middle Ages was not just poor, it was structurally hostile to human health. This isn't about a few peasants skipping baths. This was an entire civilization trapped in biological conditions it barely understood. So the real question isn't, why didn't medieval people wash? The real question is, what kind of environment makes filth feel normal and cleanliness feel dangerous? That's where the investigation begins. Let's dismantle the first comforting myth. You've probably heard this line before. Medieval people bathed all the time. They had bathhouses. That statement is technically true and deeply misleading. Yes, bathhouses existed. Yes, people did bathe. But bathing in the Middle Ages was rare, risky, seasonal, and socially restricted. Hot water required massive amounts of firewood. Firewood meant money. Money meant status. For the poor, which was over 90% of the population, bathing was an event, not a habit. Weeks passed, then months. And during winter? Water froze. Pipes didn't exist. Soap was scarce. Your body became a living ecosystem of sweat, dirt, lice, fleas, fungi, and bacteria, all competing for survival. And nobody knew that invisible organisms even existed. Now comes the part that sounds unbelievable to modern ears. Medieval medicine actively discouraged cleanliness. Doctors believed disease came from imbalanced humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Bathing was thought to open the pores. Open pores allowed bad air, miasma, to enter the body. So what happens when people start dying of mysterious illnesses? They stop washing, not because they're ignorant, but because experts told them it was dangerous. Clean skin was vulnerable skin. Here's where things turn truly unsettling. Let's talk about clothing. Most people owned one set of clothes, maybe two if they were lucky. Wool tunics absorbed sweat, urine, feces, pus, blood, and grease. These clothes were worn day and night. Sleeping naked was rare. Changing clothes daily was unimaginable. Your clothing became a second skin, one that never dried, never truly cleaned, and never stopped feeding parasites. Lice were not an exception. They were a fact of life. Children learned to pick lice from their parents' hair, the way modern kids learn to brush their teeth. Fleas jumped freely between humans, dogs, rats, and pigs, often sleeping in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. Which brings us to housing. Medieval homes were not sealed spaces. They were biological intersections. Animals slept indoors. Waste was dumped outside, or inside, if weather demanded it. Human feces were stored in pits that overflowed into streets. Urine was collected for tanning leather. Rain washed everything downhill, straight into water sources. So when medieval people drank water, they weren't just hydrating, they were ingesting. Parasite eggs, bacterial colonies, decaying organic matter, traces of human and animal waste. And they had no concept of contamination. If the water didn't immediately kill you, it was considered safe. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, how does a body survive in this environment? It doesn't thrive. It adapts. Barely. Chronic skin infections were normal. Open sores were common. Rotting teeth were expected. Bad breath wasn't embarrassing. It was universal. People didn't notice how bad things smelled because everything smelled bad. This wasn't neglect. It was normalization. Here's a detail that rarely gets discussed. Medieval people were obsessed with covering smell, not removing it. They stuffed clothing with herbs. They wore perfume sachets. They burned incense. Not to smell good, but to mask decay. Odor was interpreted as a moral and spiritual signal. Bad smells meant corruption, physical and spiritual. So instead of eliminating filth, society focused on symbolic purity. Prayers replaced hygiene, rituals replaced sanitation, and the body became something to endure, not maintain. At this point, you might wonder, if things were this bad, how did people survive at all? They survived the same way organisms survive extreme environments today. Short lifespans, high child mortality, constant illness, slow biological damage. Reaching age 40 was an achievement. Living without chronic pain was rare. This wasn't a brief dark age. This was over 1,000 years of accumulated suffering. And the worst part? People didn't know it could be different. Now we arrive at the turning point of the investigation, because hygiene didn't fail randomly. It failed because infrastructure never evolved. No plumbing, no sewage systems, no waste separation. Civilizations before the Middle Ages, like the Romans, had public baths, aqueducts, and toilets. Those systems collapsed, and medieval Europe never rebuilt them, not due to stupidity, but due to political fragmentation, resource scarcity, and fear of moral decay. Cleanliness became associated with luxury, decadence, and sin. Dirt became associated with humility and virtue, and that belief system shaped everyday life, down to the skin. So let's lock in what we've uncovered so far. Hygiene wasn't ignored. It was misunderstood. Dirt wasn't avoided. It was normalized. Disease wasn't prevented. It was spiritualized. This sets the stage for something even more disturbing. Because poor hygiene didn't just make people uncomfortable. It reshaped disease, behavior, religion, and social control. And in the next part, we'll uncover how filth became a weapon, one that killed millions and rewired society itself. This is where things stop being merely disgusting and start becoming terrifying. By the time medieval society accepted filth as normal, it had already crossed a biological point of no return. Because when hygiene collapses, disease doesn't just appear. It evolves. And nowhere is this more horrifyingly clear than in the pandemics that reshaped the medieval world. This is where dirt stops being passive and becomes an active killer. Let's start with the most infamous example, the plague. The Black Death didn't arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a world perfectly engineered for transmission. Crowded cities, open sewage, stored grain attracting rats, humans, animals, and parasites sharing the same living space. Fleas fed on infected rats. Rats died. Fleas jumped to humans, and medieval hygiene ensured those fleas were never removed. No daily washing, no clean bedding, no understanding of vectors. Once a flea bit you, the infection had free access to your bloodstream. Within days, your lymph nodes swelled into black, rotting masses. You didn't die screaming. You died melting from the inside. Here's the detail that changes everything. The plague wasn't unstoppable because it was powerful. It was unstoppable because people were already biologically compromised. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Chronic infections exhausted the body. Parasites drained nutrients. Your skin, your first line of defense, was constantly damaged. So when Yersinia pestis arrived, it didn't meet resistance. It met surrender. Now look at how society responded. Instead of improving sanitation, people turned inward. They blamed sin immorality. Foreigners, Jews, women. The poor public bathing declined even further. Hospitals became death traps. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with herbs, not to block germs, but to ward off bad air. People avoided fresh water because it was believed to invite illness. They prayed harder. They washed less. And death accelerated. This wasn't limited to the plague. Medieval hygiene failures created a constant disease background. Dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis. Skin rot, eye infections leading to blindness. Children rarely reached adulthood. Women died in childbirth not because birth was inherently fatal, but because hands, linens, and rooms were contaminated. Infections were not complications. They were expected outcomes. Now here's where the story takes a darker turn. Poor hygiene didn't just spread disease. It shaped power. When illness is everywhere, people become desperate for explanations, and whoever controls the explanation controls society. Churches framed cleanliness as spiritual, not physical. Dirt on the body could be washed away by prayer. Disease became punishment. And if sickness was moral failure, then suffering was deserved. This belief system discouraged practical solutions. Why build sewers when salvation was the real cure? Let's talk about smell again, because smell mattered more than health. Cities reeked. Human waste, rotting food, animal carcasses. Instead of removing waste, authorities regulated who was allowed to smell bad. Tanners, butchers, dyers. These professions were pushed to city edges, not because they were unhygienic, but because they offended elite noses. The problem wasn't disease, the problem was discomfort. So sanitation policy targeted visibility, not biology. And the poor paid the price. By now, a pattern is clear. Filth became invisible. Disease became normalized. Death became routine. This is what happens when hygiene collapses long enough. People stop imagining alternatives. And that psychological collapse is just as deadly as bacteria. Here's something unsettling to consider. Medieval people didn't think they were living in filth. They thought this was how the human body worked. Skin was meant to itch. Teeth were meant to rot. Children were meant to die. Pain was not a malfunction. It was the baseline. And once a society accepts pain as normal, it stops fighting it. Which brings us to the final phase of the investigation. Because medieval hygiene didn't improve slowly. It changed suddenly. Not because people became smarter, but because something forced them to confront reality. In the final part, we'll uncover what finally broke the cycle, and why modern hygiene wasn't born from comfort, but from fear, death, and collapse. This is the moment where humanity finally looked at filth and said, enough. What finally shattered the medieval relationship with filth wasn't enlightenment. It was catastrophe, stacked on catastrophe. Society didn't learn its way out of poor hygiene. It was forced out, by death on a scale too large to ignore. This is where the medieval world ends. The first crack appeared quietly. Cities grew. Trade expanded. And with density came a brutal realization. Disease didn't stay contained anymore. Outbreaks became faster, deadlier, more indiscriminate. When plague waves kept returning, again and again, people noticed something disturbing. The same neighborhoods suffered repeatedly. The same water sources produced sickness. The same smells preceded death. For the first time, pattern recognition began to override superstition. Not because people understood bacteria, but because denial stopped working. Then came the turning point most history books gloss over. Fear replaced theology. During repeated epidemics, authorities stopped asking why God was angry and started asking where disease was spreading. Quarantines emerged, not as medical insight, but as social control. Infected houses were sealed, streets were blocked, movement was restricted, and suddenly, hygiene became political. If filth threatened productivity, labor, and tax revenue, it became unacceptable, not sinful, unacceptable. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Modern hygiene was born from economics, not compassion. Dead workers don't produce, sick soldiers don't fight, dying cities don't generate power, so governments acted. Waste removal became organized. Streets were paved, water sources were protected, not to save lives, but to stabilize systems. And then something radical happened. People noticed that areas with cleaner water had fewer deaths, that childbirth survived more often when hands were washed, that hospitals that separated the sick from the healthy lost fewer patients. These weren't theories. They were results. This is where medieval assumptions collapsed. Disease was no longer moral. It was environmental. And if environment caused illness, then illness was preventable. That single idea ended the Middle Ages more decisively than any war. The body itself was redefined. Instead of something to endure, it became something to maintain. Skin wasn't meant to itch. Teeth weren't meant to rot. Children weren't meant to die. Pain stopped being destiny. It became failure of systems, infrastructure, and care. Cleanliness slowly detached from class and spirituality. Bathing returned, not as indulgence, but necessity. Soap became common. Clothing was washed. Living with animals indoors declined. Human waste was separated from human life. These changes sound obvious now. They were revolutionary then. And notice something critical. None of this required microscopes at first. People didn't need to see bacteria to understand consequence. They needed correlation. They needed survival. Science followed necessity, not the other way around. So what does this reveal about medieval hygiene? Something deeply unsettling. Medieval people weren't stupid. They were trapped inside a system that punished cleanliness, rewarded normalization of pain, and explained suffering as virtue. Once those beliefs cracked, progress accelerated violently. This leads to the final realization. The horror of medieval hygiene wasn't the dirt. It was the acceptance of it. A society can survive filth. What it cannot survive is believing filth is inevitable. That's the real warning hidden inside medieval history. Hygiene is not just soap and water. It is a world view, a belief that suffering has causes, and causes can be removed. The moment a civilization stops believing that, it slides backward, quietly, comfortably, until pain feels normal again. And that is why the truth about medieval personal hygiene still matters, not because it's disgusting, but because it proves how easily humans can adapt to conditions that are slowly killing them. And call it life.